Second speaker is Claire Taylor, who is professor in Hispanic Studies at Liverpool University, and she has worked on the literature and digital culture, and how that impacts different aspects of culture, in particular in Latin America. So one of the reasons I was particularly keen to have her here is also to have a slightly comparative perspective, because even though literature might not be limited to language only, language obviously still plays a very important role in what we do online. And the linguistic areas don't necessarily have the same attitude and approach to the digital. And what it means to interact digital is also very different in the different countries and cultures and cultural zones. Claire has published a very long list of articles and books and edited books in this area, and her two most recent books are Latin American Identity in Online Cultural Production from 2013, which was co-authored with Thea Pittman, also at Liverpool, I believe.
Leeds, University of Leeds.
And Place and Politics in Latin American Net Art in 2014. And today she will talk about, still digital, of course, from print to tweets, tracing the heritage of digital genre. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Eric, and thanks very much for inviting me to come and speak at this workshop. So, my talk today, as you can see from the title, it's looking at what might be some of the literary heritage behind some of the current digital literary experimentation. And I'm giving you two examples specifically from a Latin American and Latino American perspective. Just to give a bit of a link to the context that Erica mentioned. So my previous book was about net art and looking at how artists, broadly speaking, net artists were using digital components to tell their story. This is a snapshot today of something that I'm working on, where I'm trying to look at current experimentation with digital genres by Latin American authors, and where some of that heritage might come from in terms of prior generations of literary experimentation in the Hispanic world, but also in the non-Hispanic world as well. So hopefully I'll be able to convince you of some of that today. And one of the main things I want to get across is that there's the experimental heritage that artists and authors are building on is not exclusively an Anglophone one, which is often the assumption when we read some of the key texts of hypertext theory. There is an assumption that it's purely an Anglophone technological experimentation. So what I'm going to do first of all is obviously just give a very brief overview of the sorts of things that I look at and what are the key issues. So the sorts of literary works that I'm looking at by various authors in Latin America, using the term author loosely, include things like include multimedia components. They function by the use of hot links. There's interactivity as a key element of how these works function. It can often actually include computer-generated content itself. There's lots of other features, but these are just some of the key ones. And of course, some of the issues that it then throws up for us as maybe literary scholars or cultural studies scholars, depending on our background. But it does force us to rethink some of the traditional categories of things like text, what a text is, what it looks like, how it functions, authorship, who the author is, whether he or she has full control over the text, and the reader, of course, the role of the reader and his or her interaction with the text, and actually in many ways activating the text as much as passively just reading it and consuming it. So I'm sure these issues won't be new to many of us here. What I want to do though is kind of take a bit of a step back and go through kind of the history to date of approaches to this type of written production, and then kind of where we are now. So I'm sure again for many of us we're aware of the debates in the 90s, which is when, certainly the early 90s, those big landmark texts came out about hypertext, so Landau's text and Bolter's. And I'm being very kind of generalising here, but what we can see in these two big landmark texts was on the one hand a sort of an attempt to read hypertext as it was conceived then in the early 90s through post-structuralism, particularly Landau very heavily influenced, obviously, by Barthes and Derrida in the chapters of his classic book there. But what we then saw, and this is nothing new, so I'm kind of rehearsing, what's been said by many other scholars. In the arguments that Landau put forward, we ended up with a very utopian view of what hypertext literature could or was. And this is, this is not new to many of us. I'm just kind of, refreshing our memory of this. So Landau, for example, argued that hypertext provides an infinitely recentrable system whose provisional point of focus depends on the reader, who becomes a truly active reader. I mean, obviously, I'm deliberately putting emphasis on, but it's very Landau was very, in his early work, and he has since obviously qualified what he said in his early work, a very kind of very utopian vision of what hypertext could do to the literary, the literary work. Hypertextual materials, which by definition are open-ended, expandable and incomplete, call such notions, and he was talking about completion, the finished product, into question. And then the last one, which, well, I'll read it out first, but the hypertextual dissolution of centrality, which makes the medium such a potentially democratic one. And I'm sure all of us have watched with dismay the way in which hypertext and communication on the internet can indeed be anything other than democratic. So I'm deliberately, overemphasising here. But what we saw in the 90s, very early 90s, obviously, new technologies and a response to that, which was tended to overemphasise perhaps some of these utopian potentials. Obviously, then sort of mid to late 90s, well, late 90s onwards. Then again, some of the big names in digital literary theory have warned us, has cautioned us. Some is Arthurs being one of the first who cautioned against technological determinism, which is obviously a key here, that you can't just then say, the technology does this, therefore this is going to produce some sort of social change or some sort of new democracy. So Arthurs, I think, has put forward a really kind of convincing critique of this kind of the rhetoric of novelty, differentiation or freedom, which claims that digital technology enables readers to become authors. So this is kind of the sorts of things that maybe Landau was pointing out, saying that because hypertext is going to be rewritten, it can be etc., etc. This readers actually become authors, and Arthur's kind of warned us against that. Murray, again actually in the same year as Arthur, warned us against the fact, or said that activity alone is not agency. So the fact that the reader of a hypertext novel may have more activity, they may be involved in clicking and following links, that doesn't actually mean they have agency. So we need to think about the tensions there. It's not the same. Activity doesn't necessarily mean that you have an agency over the text. And Hales, who actually was mentioned in Erica's introduction to today, has more recently pointed out it's a fallacy to just associate the hyperlink with the empowerment of the reader or the user, and it's quite rightly pointed out that the reader and user can only follow the links that have been scripted. So it's unlimited freedom, if any, that's given to the reader there. Then another thing I think it's worth just sort of then moving on to is, if we then have these sort of debates about hypertext, and that's the kind of the be all and end all, then we moved on to critiques of that kind of technological deterministic view. We also see arguments which put forward the fact that electronic literature, you can't then just sort of return to the literary the tried and tested kind of notions of literature either as a paradigm. So Hales has pointed out, and many others have, to see electronic literature only through the lens of print is in a significant sense not to see it at all. So we're not actually paying attention to the way in which a text works if we just have recourse back to prior print literary paradigms. Parallel to this, in the mid-1990s, quite heated debates, and I think it might have even led to fisticuffs actually, over narratology and ludology, so in computer game studies. People who didn't speak to each other for several years, some said that computer games, you absolutely have to analyse them in terms of the narratology, the narrative, and others very firmly said no, it's ludology, there is no narrative, that's an imported concept from literary studies, etc., etc. I think they might be on speaking terms again now, but I think it's worth pointing out then that, you know, some of those notions that maybe that would come from literary studies, such as the narrative arc, those have also been contested when looking at digital formats. So we basically end up with lots of kind of tensions. Those of us who work, broadly speaking, within digital culture, looking at cultural production that make use of digital technologies. Where do we start? What do we do? So, what I've kind of summed it up from my perspective, what I think are three key kind of conundrums, and there's one conundrum: how do we actually approach digital literature? And three things that I try to bear in mind when as a scholar, I'm approaching this sort of production around digital literature. So I think, yes, we do have to take on board that the specifics of digital technologies must be recognised. So we can't uncritically apply literary norms to a digital product. So I can't just say pick up a hypertext novel, not that I pick it up, I would open a hypertext novel, and then just talk about, say, the characterisation and make no reference to any of the technologies that are in there. I can't just do that. Having said that, the second thing I always try and bear in mind is that digital technologies don't determine the cultural product. So I think, going back to Arthur's warning against technological determinism is really important. So that technologies aren't inherently liberatory, experimental per se. The medium, Patchy McLuhan, doesn't necessarily make the message when we're talking about digital technologies. But also the third, and this is kind of my pitch for those of us who are monolinguists around the table, that literary heritage, digital literary products actually speak back to a pre-digital literary heritage. And that meaning, therefore, that writers and artists don't work in a vacuum. So it's not as if there's suddenly an explosion of, say, the hypertext novel, and the authors of these novels are completely radically new and doing something which has no predecessors. In fact, they very often insert themselves within a long tradition of literary experimentation. They dialogue with their predecessors and their contemporaries. And as a monolinguist, my interest is in the fact that dialogue is not an Anglophone dialogue there. So that's kind of my preamble of what I'm hopefully going to be showing you some examples of today. So I'm going to be talking you through two authors / artists. We can come back to this notion of how they define themselves, but I'm looking at two of their literary works today. Looking at their works as examples of kind of a negotiation of existing literary genres, and I conceive their works as kind of on a continuum. So there's this continuum of different literary genres, and theirs still form a part of this continuum. I hope to convince you that they're speaking back to a kind of rich Hispanic tradition of literary experimentation. So it's not an experimentation that's come about through the development of technologies in Anglophone context. It's actually a much more richer literary heritage. Some examples, I'll show you some examples today, but there's a lot of other examples you can see in writers in Latin America and in Spain who are dialoguing, for example, with poesía concretista, concrete poetry, which was the poetry which can be kind of reassembled, calligramas, and with a nod to France actually, calligram. As an aside, I will say I'm going to claim calligramas. I think Huidobro's calligramas might have been published slightly before Apollinaires' calligrama. I think same year, but maybe slightly earlier. But anyway, we can argue that one over who owns calligramas or calligram. Testimonio, which is a hugely strong tradition in Latin America from the 60s onwards of politically committed testimonial writing related to the broadly speaking, subaltern struggles in that region. All of these are important precursors, and there are many, many more of the sorts of experimentation we now see on the web. What I want to argue, though, is that the authors, or the best authors who are doing that in digital literature today in Latin America and Latino America, they maintain this dialogue with their precursors, and a dialogue with the technology themselves that's critical and self-aware. So I think this is for me is one of the most exciting things about what's being done today by authors in Latin America. So the new hybrid forms, as I said, this is kind of part of something that I'm working. I'm going to show you just two authors, but there's a rise of new kind of hybrid forms which bring together digital forms of communication and potentially kind of prior literary genres. So Twitter poetry, electronic ballads, blog aforismos, I'm going to be talking through one of those, hypertext short stories, the blog novela, novela colectiva, hypertext short stories, which for some reason I've repeated, hypertext documentaries, anipoemas, there's some stuff that I absolutely love, microrelatos. So there's lots of really exciting work being done, I think, in Latin America, kind of developing these new genres which are hybrids, and that's why I put the kind of new in brackets. Maybe they're more hybrid genres, building on previous genres than necessarily the new. So the first author I want to introduce you to, and hopefully you'll enjoy the work I'm going to show you, and you'll go and have a look at some of her other stories. Belengache. So she's Spanish Argentinian. She's a leading writer of experimental fiction, both print and digital. So she also writes. She also does publish print novels which don't have any digital components. She publishes in a variety of genres, so one of the ones she's published in most frequently are net poetry, literary blogs, video poesy and hypertext fictions. She's one of the founding members of the Fin del Mundo group, so you might have come across some of the others, so Jorge Jarro, Gustavo Romano, Carlos Trilnik. And she's also quite widely published in terms of her theoretical writings as well. So she's very engaged in the theoretical writings on experimental narrative more broadly. So I'm going to be talking you through, or showing you some examples from one of her latest collections of poetry or word toys. We'll come back to that definition if you want in the discussion. 2011, she describes it as poesía digital interactiva, so digital interactive poetry, but in other contexts she describes these as word toys. You can see from the title itself. It's comprised of 5, so it's a poetry collection, 5 interactive poems. What she does, she takes extracts from Góngora Soledades, and I'll kind of look at this in a bit more detail. She then subjects them to remixing, visualizations, animations, interactions with the reader, user, and there's an intermingling of kind of the literary sources with digital motifs throughout. So some really exciting work that's going on here, I think. So what she does in this work then, she combines very, very detailed intertextual reference to Soledades, one of the classics of Golden Age Spanish literature, with constantly metatextual references to the process of the poem's own digital creation. And what she does is that she allies digital technologies with Baroque, a prior period of Baroque literary experimentation. What she then does, though, she doesn't argue that digital technologies are purely liberatory or groundbreaking per se. So she doesn't say this is what Góngora did in the Baroque, and look, now we can do it with bells and whistles as well, isn't it great? She's not necessarily saying that. She often actually deliberately references dated or limited technologies. So she plays with, but also questions some of those key notions of interactive literature. So I'm going to show you some examples of how she does this. So within this poetry collection, the first one is Dedicatoria Espiral, so spiral dedication. The source of this, so where she's taken it from the Soledades, is Góngora's dedication to Alonso Diego López de Zúñiga Sotomayor, who was Duque de Béjar. And in each of the cases of these poems, Gachi has written a preamble to the work before we go into it. So I'm just going to show you. I'm hoping the internet connection definitely works now. Good. So this is Dedicatoria Espiral. Okay, so if we click onto it, so this is what her word toy looks like. So Dedicatoria Espiral, she has a bit of a preamble here. And then I'm going to launch the work in a moment after I've given a bit of an explanation, a bit of an introduction, and then hopefully you'll see what she's attempting to do. So, let me get back to the PowerPoint. Yeah. So that's her preamble, and in it she sets out the predilection for the Baroque, the reason why she's chosen to dialogue with Góngora. She says, for example, that a choice of Góngora is based on his rejection of lo inerte, lo permanente, so the inert and the permanent, and she likes Góngora. The reason why this work is all to do with Góngora is the favouring of estética multiforme plural, a plural and multiform aesthetic, las formas abiertas, so open-ended forms, la elipsis, el espiral, the ellipsis and the spiral. So she's very much drawing out in this preamble a parallel between, on the one hand, the spiral as representative of Gongara's stylistic excess, and I'll show you some examples of that, and also the fact that what Gongara did in the time of the Baroque is a kind of parallel to what we can do now through digital technologies, so the open-endedness, experimental forms that are made more possible by digital technologies. So, I'm now going to show you, the ricotta ispirale. So what she does in this work, she presents the words of the original dedication in a spiral. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. So in each case, I want to entrar. Okay, so the text looks like this. And then what happens when we then decide, okay, I want to go and see if I can read some of this text. This is what happens. And then you go, oh, I'm going to want to look at that word over there. Ah! Okay, so as you can see, what I'm doing here, I'm moving my mouse, and every time I try and grasp a word, it spins away from me. Okay, so that's the ricotta ispirale. Exactly. And then eventually you work out, okay, the closer I go to the centre, then I can stop it. But then, yeah, okay. But if you actually want to close in on a word, you end up not being able to. So what I think she's doing here, clearly, I think it's calligram-esque. So she's building on that another literary tradition, which we all shared between Hispanic and French literary tradition of the calligramos or calligram. But I think it's more than it just being just sort of digital pyrotechnics. I think actually there's a very serious point that she's trying to make here. It's serious but playful, and it's an engagement with poetic tradition. And what I think she's attempting to do is that she's attempting to recreate for the reader that sensation that the 17th century reader had when first faced with Gongara's poetry, which was the stylistic excess, the slippage of the inability to grasp immediately the meaning. This is reenacted for us in the 21st century with these digital technologies. So I think what she's attempting to do there in Gongara, Gongara famed for his stylistic excess, complex metaphors, overturning of the norms of syntax, use of catachresis. So taking a quotation from Collins, one of the recent scholarly works on Gongara, saying that the poet Gongara saturates the text with rhetorical figures, heaps elaborate conceit upon elaborate conceit, contorts syntax with hyperbata, interrupts narrative flow with ellipses, bombards his audience non-stop with synesthesic effects and allusions to classical myth. So the reader bombarded and unable to grasp all of this immediately in one go in the 17th century. This is Gacci's humorous, but I think it's partly serious attempt to recreate that for us through the movement, the actual literal movement of the text across the page. So that's one example. This, as I said, from her collection. I'm now going to show you another one of her digital poems. This is entitled In breve spazio mucha primavera, so in a short space much spring. We'll come back to where that title comes from. It's taken from like 339 of the Soledad Segunda, and that's a section of the poem, the piscatory section of the poem. It deals with the small community of fishermen. It's been pointed out by scholars of Gongara that this is the pastoral ideal, but it's an ideal that's constantly called into question, that's never actually achieved in the poem. So Beverley, who's one of the leading scholars really on Gongara, has called it this dream of a refuge from history and just this fiction of this psychic wholeness. What we see in Gacci, what she uses this line to do is to get us thinking about literary elusiveness, the function of the signifier, and the potentials of digital technologies. So this is what the page looks like when we start. And as I said, hopefully our digital technologies are going to work for us. If I can get back to I can get my mouse off this and actually get my mouse back and get back to the Safari page that I want to. Okay. Right, I'm letting you help with this, Erica. How do I get back to these pages and how do I open all of them? Great, thank you. Yeah, that's where I want to be, thank you. So this one, I absolutely love this as well, the conceit of the flipping over the pages of the book. I really enjoy that every time I go through it. So this is En breve espacio, mucha primavera. So when we enter this text, this is what this poem looks like. So we started with el sol, the sun. We click on it, and then we get different pop-up windows. Dulce, pues no desdeñado, de muchos pocos de moroso dueño. So we click on different windows, and then we get different other windows coming up here. So this is how this poem, En breve espacio, mucha primavera. And you can see some of them disappearing there. So we've got clearly the conceit of the frame within a frame. So we've got in which parallels the kind of the Gongren technique of the metaphor within the metaphor. Very famous for having a metaphor, and hidden within that metaphor is yet another metaphor. So I think what she's attempting to do here is reproduce that with the frame within a frame, the constant windows that open within the work. This notion of the kind of continually elusive textual play of Gongora. So again, Collins, talking about Gongora, points out the elaborate grafting of systems of connection onto one another and the mixing of their constituent parts in a hybrid meta-system of meaning. And I think this is what Gachi's pulling out from Gongora and creating for us a digital version through the pop-up windows. Worth pointing out, No menos en ramal que florido, with which the preamble starts, doesn't actually appear in the Soledades. It's a mashup of two different lines from Góngora. So she's already taking the original text and then transforming them. And as you've seen, what happens, the reader user, you click on an underlined word, activates a new window. So we've got sol, dulce, muchos, pocos marfil, etc., etc. You can see one particular chain there. Clearly what I think she's doing is foregrounding the hyperlink as a poetic device. And I think she's drawing out perhaps some of the potentials for hyperlinking to work through juxtaposition, concatenation, assemblage. So some of those notions that were indeed brought up by Landau in his early works and Hales more recently. So I think she is drawing out for us again a parallel between Gongora techniques and the potentials of digital technologies.
Sorry, can I just ask with that, how much of that is the original poem? So of those words that sprung up, is that the full line?
Yes, what we get is in fact the poems themselves, and some of those quotes, I'll show you actually just the next one. What you'll see is that a lot of the text, so El Sol obviously is just one word, the sun, but when you actually see what looks like a line of the poem, it's in fact a mashup that she's taken from two different lines which don't follow each other, and there's no obvious either semantic connection or kind of logical connection in terms of the narrative that where it comes from in the poem. So the lexia themselves are actually mashups. The links between the lexia don't follow a logical pattern. So, for example, when we get from marfil, we ought to pues no de leda enamorado. There's no reason why. There's no semantic connection. There's no kind of logical connection there. And I think she's attempting to imitate Góngora's catachresis, in which the two elements of comparison are incongruous, and it's the reader or user is forced to make this meaning. But we end up when you kind of play through it to a certain stage, readerly agency is also illusory. So we end up at some points where there's only one potential hot link, and we end up having no choice. So there's potential sort of limitations that Gachi deliberately sets for us as the reader user here. So in terms of some of the the mashups there, it's to do with the fact she's taking different parts of the poem and kind of mashing them together in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The final one I want to show you is called El llanto peregrino, so the pilgrim's weeping. And again, she has this preamble, and I think again quite a tongue-in-cheek preamble, so she points out that she's emulating labyrinth poems, those linguistic visual games so cherished by the Baroque, and taking up the Baroque and Borgesian idea of the book as a labyrinth. So obviously in Borges, el sendero que bifurca, in his collection Fricciones. And she, in this preamble, says the pilgrim moves along a complex path, according to his circumstances, just as the reader moves through the verses written by Góngora, through the ramifications and wanderings of language. So El llanto peregrino, what it does, it takes an extract from Sola Segunda, starting Regiones Pisea Ajenas, and there's a human figure that moves through the text. So, again, I shall attempt to show you this one. So I need to close this one down, is that right? Close that one, how did I get that one? To get back to...
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So this is El Llanto del Peregrino. Oh, how interesting on your map. Okay, interesting. I shall show you what it looks like from a different browser.
I have Firefox. I don't know if you
I'll explain how it works. So what happens when the Flash does work? You get a human figure that moves across a block of text, and I'll show you a screenshot of what happens. But when you then attempt to traverse the text, the human figure, which is basically your avatar to get through the text, it's circumscribed. So there's only certain moments that you can actually, certain part or movements that you're allowed to do. You can move up and down a very small part of the text. You can't get any further than the top of the line you can already see. And what happens is that you can just glimpse the bottom line of the next or the previous line of poetry, and you can't get to it. So you're this supposedly a peregrino figure, so a pilgrim figure, which is one of these these key figures for Gace, because she writes a lot about nomadism and moving wanderings. This similar purported kind of wanderings and nomadic behaviour is in fact bound by the limits that Gace set upon this text. So hopefully what I've shown you in terms of Ngongora word choice is that this collection, it's very playful, but I think it's very creative, and it has a serious side as well. And what she does throughout, I've shown you just 3 of the poems, but she constantly compares Ngongoran techniques to contemporary literary digital experimentation. So we've got Baroque literary elusiveness, we've ended up with present day mashups, hyperbaton, we've got animated spirals, catachresis, we've got hot linking, deferred chain of meaning, we've got chains of lexia. But I think what Gace's doing while she's establishing these links, she's not saying that digital technologies are kind of a teleological endpoint of literary experimentation. So she's not saying that digital technologies are the solution to the problems of the printed page that Ngongora and his contemporaries grappled with. Because she also it's very self-aware and makes us aware of the limits, she's also questioning the same technologies that she's using here in quite a clever and also kind of amusing way. So that's one example of an engagement with a kind of a sort of 17th century kind of classic work of Hispanic literature. I'm now going to show you another writer and artist who engages with prior literary forms, but of a different type. This is Eduardo Navas, who's Latino, so he's of Salvadoran heritage, but living and working in the US. He's an artist, critic, theorist, curator, and has been involved in projects since the 1990s, and his work is kind of at the crossovers between art, culture, new media. And he's particularly interested in the remixing of already existing source texts and images. So this is the kind of the fundamentals of all of his work. I'm going to show you one work, which is from 2011, which is entitled Minima Moralia Redux. It's a blog-based work, so he uses the blog format for literary and creative purposes. What he does is he remixes and visualises excerpts of Adorno's Minima Moralia, Reflexionen aus dem beschädigten Leben, and apologies because that's my A-level German there, so apologies for my pronunciation. And he then does a creative remix of these. There's 153 aphorisms, and his project, which is still ongoing, so maybe if you go in a couple of months' time, you might see more than I'm showing you today, is to eventually visualise all of these aphorisms. What's he doing in this work? Well, clearly he's engaging with the prior paradigm, but which in itself, as we'll see, also engages with the prior paradigm, and he's clearly updating Adorno. So Adorno's Minima Moralia, published 51, but written between 44 and 47, in itself was a kind of a rewriting of a prior paradigm. It was a pun on Aristotle's treatise on ethics, Magna Moralia. And what Adorno was doing in that text was, according to Jarosinski, was plotting a new course of philosophy, a path beginning with the careful scrutiny of the minute and expanding into larger conceptual constellations. So Adorno in Minima Moralia focused on social practices, institutions, political and economic structures, the bourgeois and the individual in these different aphorisms. And it was an attempt, according to Bernard, for Adorno's attempt to spell out the alienation of the individual into its minutest ramifications in everyday life. So that's the source text, which in itself was dialoguing with the previous precursor. But one of the interesting things is that what Adorno was doing, and it was in a book of aphorisms, was the fact he was deliberately using the genre against the grain. So it's the longest quotation here from Norberg, but we'll just look at the first bit. But Adorno packs a socio-theoretical diagnosis into a generic form that is undermined by this very diagnosis. And I'll leave you if you want to read the rest of that quotation. But in other words, Adorno's text isn't to oblige the reader to comply with societal norms, which would be the usual use of the Book of Aphorisms. It tells you how to comply, it tells you how to live your life and comply with society. It actually wants to unmask the structures underlying these societal norms. So I think this is absolutely key in terms of what Adorno's book was doing. It was using a prior textual format, the notion of the Book of Aphorisms, but to try to actually question the norms of that society rather than to use the aphorism to make you conform to them. And Norberg said it robs the reader of the belief inherent to the mode of address of the advice book, namely that pressing problems and moral issues can be adequately grasped and dealt with within the individual's immediate sphere of cognition and influence. So that's what Navas is building on. He's deliberately taken Adorno's source text and he's deliberately remixing it. So what, in terms of what Navas does that's new, or why he's done it, well, the sustained critique of industrial society and the dominant form of capitalism in Adorno's time was obviously statist capitalism. And also, the key feature of Adorno was this reworking of existing literary forms. So the Magna Moralia of Aristotle and this whole genre of the Book of Aphorisms and the Book and conduct literature as a broader genre. What Navas does is he updates Adorno, and for Navas it's now the neoliberal corporatist model of capitalism that comes under scrutiny, so it's no longer statist. And also the critique, wherein Adorno is a critique of the whole notion of a Book of Aphorisms. In Navas it's the critique of the social media platform through which it works and the issues of policing, data valence, etc. So I'll show you some examples of this. This is a preamble from Navas telling us about what he's attempting to do, and Navas himself, again, is also a theorist of digital culture and has written quite a lot of theory about what he calls remix and has defined different types of remix. And he argues this is to do with the selective remix, which consists of adding to or subtracting material from pre-existing source. The selective material may not only extend the pre-existing material but can also contain new sections while always keeping the source recognisable. In this fashion, Adorno's aphorisms are rewritten to make evident how his voice is still worth revisiting. And I'll show you some examples of this. So how he remixes Adorno, he takes Adorno's original aphorisms, he produces boxes of lexia, and he produces word clouds based on them. So text of different font sizes, and obviously the size of the font indicates the frequency with which that word is used within the paragraph. So he visualises Adorno's text with these word clouds, and also visualises, in some of the later aphorisms that he's used, visualises them through Google image searches. So immediately obvious is that Navas is using the blog format. Obviously that's obvious to us, but also that these word clouds kind of a shorthand really for the kind of the tag clouds of social media platforms here. But what he's doing, he also actually remixes the aphorisms themselves. So he produces for us a word cloud based on Adorno's aphorism. So I've taken here an example of aphorism 14. So I'll show you what this looks like in real time, hopefully.
Yep.
Oh, okay. No, I wanted to get back to now. It's okay. I shall show you the screen grab that I've got instead. It's pretty much the same. So we see a word cloud based on Adorno's aphorism. So I've taken an example here, aphorism 14. entitled Le Bourgeois Revenant. And in the original, we read, whatever was once good and decent in bourgeois values, independence, perseverance, forethought, circumspection, has been corrupted utterly, and that the bourgeois live on like spectres threatening doom. And this is the word cloud that Navas has produced based on that aphorism from Adorno. But what we get in Navas's version, and he doesn't tell us, so you have to really work hard. He doesn't tell you he's done this. So he starts with Adorno's familiar opening lines of the aphorism. But then the third sentence in Navas's version is a small but quite significant addition. So Adorno said to us, private life, however, is marked by this. And then suddenly in the middle of Adorno we get this sentence. Private life is certainly marked by this, quite inevitably, given that the concept of private was originally conceived by the very system that now data mines it in the name of the emergent social media market. So when I was first looking at Navas, I remember kind of reading through this and thinking, hang on, Adorno definitely didn't know about data mining. That something's going on here. And then I realised what Navas was doing. It's very clever. So what Navas has done, without telling us, just makes us work harder, is updating this aphorism for our era of informational capitalism. So whereas Adorno's concern was, the purportedly private institutions such as the family upheld statist capitalism. For Navas, the term private is now interpreted in terms of data privacy and the fact that data mining lies in the hands of big international corporations. So what we then see, Navas is, in the visualisation, he actually then provides us with two different visualisations. The first of which is the visualisation of the original Adorno, and the second of which is the visualisation of Navas's. And we can clearly see here, this is a clear example, for Adorno's time, bourgeois was the word, which was the most frequently repeated and the most prominent, and now we can see private. So the private corporations and their increasing grip on us in the age of late capitalism. So what I think Navas is doing is he's remixing Adorno for late informational capitalism, whereas for Adorno the private realm reflected this dominant social order. For Navas now the private is now in terms of data privacy, and it's a critique directed at the data mining that lies in the hands of and is used to serve the interests of corporate giants. So a lot of obviously work being done on this recently, so terms such as wiki surveillance, data surveillance, electronic eye, all of these terms are to do with the way in which data on the internet is in fact mined. And the smaller terms in the word cloud are subordinate to the term private as a structuring node of the system for Adorno. And then we have a transition from this form of capitalism based on the bourgeois statism in Adorno's time to our form of capitalism based on private finance and corporatism. And actually something that's picking up on something that Francois mentioned in response to one of the comments, I think we have to read through some of the work that's been done, Marxist informed work that's been done on the way in which social media platforms work. Christian Fuchs's work I think is really important. He's argued the fact that data accumulation or capital accumulation on social media and how it works. It works through a commodification of users and their data. So basically all of us, and myself included, I've been busy tweeting this morning and posting details of events on Facebook. We are all producing surplus value for the owners of those platforms, and it's all surplus value because we work for free. I'm not getting paid a penny for it. So I think what Navas is pointing our attention towards is the fact, the way in which 21st century informational capitalism works, and how privacy, Fuchs's words, are connected to surplus value, exploitation and class. So this is those issues haven't gone away. They've been transformed under late capitalism, but those issues still need our attention. I think this is Navas's key point he's trying to put across for us. So just to kind of sum up Navas before I have a general sort of summing up of what I hope I've persuaded you about. For Navas, I think he's producing new updated aphorisms for the 21st century, and there is certainly bears traces of the original aura, so a Marxist influenced scrutiny of the minutiae of everyday life. But his version brings into focus that it's a minutiae of everyday life under informational capitalism, where we're actually producing this surplus value. We've got obviously the blog as platform, word clouds as visualization tool, the Google Images search engine in the foregrounding of that. So it's an interrogation, or there's an interrogation in Navas and in Adorno of the textual formats themselves, whether digital or pre-digital. So whereas Adorno wrote a book of aphorisms that was a critique of the very format of the book itself, the aphorisms are challenging, critical. Navas, I think, is critiquing the format of the blog and wider social media platforms. So all the while that we're reading and engaging, we're also being asked to question the very format that we're using. So just as sort of some tentative conclusions then, I think what's interesting in the works of Navas and Gachi and many other Latin American and Latino writers and artists is the way in which their works make often overt nods to the possibilities enabled by digital technologies. They also maintain really close dialogues with pre-digital existing literary discourses. And often the works are very self-conscious, they comment on the medium itself. But having said that, I think it's not that they're arguing that digital technologies offer a kind of proliferation of new, anti-linear, revolutionary reading patterns per se, that this is where the future is what we should all be doing. They do often comment more on the limitations, the potentials, but also the limitations of those technologies and the dangers of those technologies. And there is I would argue, a long literary heritage of authors attempting to rework literary and textual norms, and these authors are part of that heritage. And in their digital literary genres, I would argue, often kind of dramatise some of the potentials of digital technology, but at the same time maybe indicate the impossibilities or the tensions in the actual procedure enactment of their works.